Good morning, everyone. It's September 21st at 9:03 a.m. I officially call the Mobile Source Committee meeting to order. And I think Barbara Beard wants to give us a brief statement.
Yes,
Barbara, go right ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. For benefit of the audience, we're now having implemented for the board committees a system where if you would like to make a comment on an agenda item or public comment, to fill out a card and provide it to the clerk. The reason is that that will allow us to go through the agenda more expeditiously and not have to stop for every item and inquire whether there's comment. For those that there's no comment, we'll just simply go right through to the next item. So I would appreciate that if you would fill out your forms either now or during the item if you become aware that you need to comment. Thank you, Dr. Parker.
Let the record show that committee members that are present today is Pro Tem Mitchell and Supervisor Solis. Okay, so we will now go ahead and to our first item on the agenda. Is informational item number 1, Ian McMillan, with local government land use policies to reduce air pollution exposure from mobile sources. Go right ahead, Ian.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Parker. My name is Ian McMillan. I'm a Planning and Rules Manager here at the Air District. I wanted to touch just briefly on a topic today that comes up many times in a lot of different contexts, and so we wanted to kind of put everything all together in sort of one discussion related to local government land use policies and specifically thinking about mobile sources. So just a quick overview. I should say most of this will just be an overview. There's not really a whole lot of new things that we're going to be talking about here. We'll talk a little bit about some of the upcoming activities with what our district is doing, but this is largely an overview of what's already existing out there. So along those lines, what we do know very clearly is that pollutant concentrations are higher closer to a freeway than they are farther from a freeway. This is well-established science at this point. The graph on the left in green shows ultrafine particle counts close to a freeway and far from a freeway. And you see that there's a very clear relationship there. It's well established, and that it changes time of day, time of year. We can get into the details of it, but it's very clear that pollutant concentrations, such as ultrafine particles, are much higher closer to a freeway. What we also know from a variety of other studies is that health outcomes are much worse closer to a freeway. For those living and going to school and working near freeways, that health outcomes are much worse compared to those who are farther away. A graph here, this is one that really illustrates that point, and this is from the USC Children's Health Study. And it shows on the left for those who live in kind of a more rural area far from a freeway with low regional fine particulate matter, that the lung function is normal. It's 100%. It's kind of typical lung function that you would expect in the population. But if we look maybe to the next one to the right, we see, well, what if you are in that same kind of community? And this is Southern California community, so the one on the left is Santa Maria. And then the next one over is, well, what if you have low regional fine particulate matter, but you're close to a freeway? And you see that the lung function goes down. Similarly, let's flip that. What if we have high regional PM, but you're far from a freeway? So this would be like the Inland Empire region. And we see that's even worse. And then again, if you double up on all that, high regional PM and close to the freeway, it's even worse. So we see that there's a very clear relationship here. Just to put this in context, from this particular study, they said that this effect is actually 10 times greater than the effect of maternal secondhand smoke at 1 pack a day. So this is a very noticeable effect, and it's concerning when considering this on a population weighted or on a population basis. What are the pollutants of concern? Well, we have toxic air contaminants like diesel particulate matter, that's well known, VOCs such as benzene, etc. We have the criteria pollutants, in particular looking at fine particle matter and nitrogen dioxide. We have new monitoring that we've been doing over the last few years, some requirements from EPA to do some new near roadway monitoring. And what we found is that in general, the criteria pollutants aren't as big a concern as one would think. I say that, however, we do have one site that might be over some of the ambient air quality standards, although that site, it's largely dominated by the regional signal as opposed to the near roadway signal. So we're seeing it in maybe some other pollutants where we see a bigger effect, and that's, for example, in ultrafine particles. And so that first graph that I showed on the first slide really illustrates ultrafine particles have a very significantly higher concentration closer to roadways. There is a little bit of good news here that we found, or some scientists over at UCLA have been doing some of this work and have found that particle counts, looking at ultrafine particles, are going way down. And a lot of this is due to cleaner engines and cleaner cars on the road. So we have some substantial reductions that have been occurring over the last decade and a half here in Southern California. This is a map on this next slide that the LA Times pulled together actually a few months ago. It's actually a pretty interesting look at where do people live in LA. And so you can see on this map, every little tiny orange dot is where 10 people live. And it's, for those within 1,000 feet of a freeway, and the freeways pop out and you see, wow, there sure are a lot of people that live close to freeways. If we look at this more statistically, we see from the Southern California Association of Governments, they looked at this kind of issue, and they found that, for example, in 2012, about 4% of households are within 500 feet of a freeway. Similarly, about 8% of employment is within 500 feet. If we look just more locally at LA City, nearly 500,000 people live within 1,000 feet of a freeway, and that's just the existing population. What we also see is moving forward, on the new developments coming through and CEQA documents that we get here internally at the district from other agencies for our review. We see that about a little more than 10% of those have residential land uses that are within 500 feet of a freeway. So this is definitely an ongoing issue. So how do we address this? So really the primary way to try to get at this that we've been saying for a long time, and it continues to be the case, is to reduce emissions. This can address a lot of the issues that we're struggling with as an agency. It's not just a proximity issue, you need to reduce emissions. And there's actually a really, I think, good example of this where we've seen this has worked in the past, and thinking about land use proximity and air quality impacts. And it wasn't so long ago that drive-throughs and parking lots we had these same kinds of concerns about local land use and air quality proximity. And we don't hear about that much anymore. And it's largely because carbon monoxide, while still just as much of a concern in high concentrations, is not in such high concentrations anymore coming out of tailpipes. And so we aren't seeing those same kinds of localized air quality impacts around those land uses. But we do see it around a lot of other land uses, in particular for goods movement. So we know that there's a lot of new technologies coming along. We see that we get dramatic reductions from these new technologies. We also hear a lot about are there other sorts of land use decisions that could be made on reduced VMT, for example. And there's a lot of focus to try to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. In particular, this is a key strategy when looking at greenhouse gases. What we tend to see there when it comes to localized pollution, that the reductions there are certainly good. It's always good to get more reductions given our air quality challenges, but we're getting maybe 5-10% kind of reduction in the near term on those kinds of policies, as opposed to tailpipe emission reductions. You can start getting 90+% reductions. So the other key strategy for trying to address this proximity issue is looking at reducing exposure. Right, and so, for example, we have site design. So maybe one example here might be, you have two different possibilities to look at a particular project. And so maybe on the left, if you look at that yellow line, we can imagine that that set of yellow lines is a freeway. You might, in one case, have a park right next to the freeway, but in the other case, you can say, well, can we reconfigure this site so that the parking acts as a little bit of a buffer zone and the park is put farther away where outside exposure is going to occur. So there's ways to look at site configuration to try to build in buffer zones everywhere that you can to try to reduce the concentrations of pollutants that people would be breathing. Second consideration are barriers. And so on the background image, as you can see here, of thinking about sound walls. Sound walls are one thing that are often thought that can really help protect against pollution from a freeway, but it really depends on what you do with that sound wall. So for those balconies that are looking right over that sound wall, it doesn't really help a whole lot. Similarly, if we look at vegetation, that's kind of a small image from here, but really thick vegetation can be very effective. Vegetation that is not very thick and actually can channelize flow and can actually make things worse. And so it really depends on what these barriers look like. They can help, but they can also actually, in some cases, make things worse. So you got to be really careful when it comes to barriers. Thinking also about building design, one thing that's really talked about a lot are filters, high efficiency filters. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but these have been found to be pretty effective when it comes to particles, including for ultrafine particles. There's a number of different land use policies. If we look at all the I don't know, 160 some odd cities that are in our jurisdiction, each city has its own take on land use. There's a couple jurisdictions I want to point to here. For example, in LA County, the Community Development Commission for a long time now has not been funding housing projects within 500 feet of a freeway. The city of LA has had a variety of policies it's been implementing and developing through the last few years. One just recently went in August 2016. I just want to point out this slide's a little bit different than when what went out with the agenda. I just updated this with what happened in August, so you'll see that there in red. So for example, for filters that need to be put into buildings, new buildings within 1,000 feet of a freeway, there's a new policy to also have city inspectors look at that every 4 years on their normal 4-year schedule to make sure those filters are still installed. There had been some noticing to developers of residences within 1,000 feet of a freeway. That notification has really been expanded to make that sort of available, for example, on the online ZEMAS zoning information portal that the city has. It's now more readily available notification. They're also looking at developing some new site configuration guidelines, similar to what I talked about before. Can you put tot lots away from a freeway if you have the ability? Think about how you configure balconies, et cetera. So they'll be developing some guidelines there. But what they are saying also is that health risk assessments are no longer required. They feel that there isn't a whole lot of value from their standpoint because they have all these other policies in place. And so they are taking that out of the CEQA process. The one thing that we also, as they were developing this, that we were really encouraging them to do was to look at their EV charging infrastructure policies. They currently have a requirement for 5% of all new parking spaces to at least be EV ready. They're looking at expanding that to up to 20%. And so they'll be doing that in these coming months and year or so. If we transition a little bit into a different kind of land use, looking at schools, there's within the California Education Code, there is often it's cited as a prohibition against building schools within 500 feet of a freeway. It's more a discouragement. There are ways to actually site within 500 feet of a freeway, but it's harder to do. Mainly, a school district, when it's acquiring a school, has to make a determination that health risks are less than significant, or similar in the CEQA process, they can make a statement of overriding considerations if they wanted to, or if they felt that that was necessary. It does allow for mitigation. This law does not apply to private or charter schools, so it does only apply to public school districts when they're acquiring a site. Other school districts have taken a harder line. So, for example, LA Unified School District, just about a decade ago, implemented a more stringent policy that's much more effectively a ban. A different kind of land use, if we look, for example, at warehouses, there's some guidelines that are out there, for example, from the Western Riverside Council of Governments. Those are widely cited guidelines of looking at how to develop warehouses and thinking about the surrounding land uses to, for example, ensure that trucks aren't queuing along the roadways, that there's ample parking, anti-idling policies, that sort of thing. So those guidelines have been out for a long time now. The other way that we've seen local jurisdictions deal with this is on a project-by-project basis. So, for example, recently in Riverside County, there's a project at the San Gorgonio Pass, a warehouse project, and I think a second project as well, where they actually charged a fee to that warehouse project, an air quality fee that went to the county. They're still determining exactly how they want to spend those funds. It would be for air quality benefits. We've been having some initial conversations with them about that. Obviously, we are very focused on cleaner technologies. We think that's a good use of those funds, but they're still trying to work through that. The next slide here. Touching again on this reducing vehicle miles traveled, there's a number of policies at the state level to look at this. Obviously, SB 375 with sustainable community strategies. There's some targets that are statewide that apply to each metropolitan region. When we look at, well, how does this affect South Coast, we see that the 2016 SCS, which is incorporated within the AQMP, reduces about 3 tons a day of NOx by 2022. Which is good. It's nothing to sneeze at. We need more than 100 tons a day, so we have a long ways to go, but this is certainly a good thing. CARB recently approved new regional targets, so up to it's a 19% reduction required by 2035 for these similar kinds of policies. A different way of looking at this is with SB 743, which changed how transportation analyses occur within CEQA. So the previous metric for looking whether or not there's a transportation impact for new development was looking at congestion, level of service. Is there a lot of congestion from a project? The new way of looking at it now is VMT based. Does a project have high or low VMT? And it's just a different way of looking at of traffic impacts. And this can really affect some land use decisions. Occasionally, there will be some bumping up of different policy goals here. So on the picture there, we see, for example, the 105 freeway trends east-west right there in South LA County. We have the green line located right in the middle of the freeway. The blue line also goes right there. You have a nice transit hub with some commercial and residential uses right around it. Is there an opportunity to maybe do some different kind of land use there to really densify that transit hub? But again, you're right next to a freeway. There's some real challenges here of competing policy goals. Touching on just a few more guidance documents. So CARB has their land use guidance document, land use handbook, which is widely cited within CEQA. That's from 2005. They updated, in particular, looking at the issue of freeways and near roadway exposure in 2017, a very detailed document. They're also working on a new document on large freight facilities, focusing first on warehouses and distribution centers. We're working with CARB as they're developing this. This is one of the things that we've been looking to pursue as part of our facility-based measures. Looking more specifically at what the Air District has been doing. So, we obviously can issue guidance. We have no land use authority, and that's, we can really just work as an advisory agency for other land use agencies. So within the 2012 AQMP, we had an entire chapter looking at near roadway exposure and ultrafine particles. We have our air quality analysis handbook that has, while I guess the cover page on the handbook is a bit old, there are a number of sections that have been updated since that time, including localized thresholds. And so there's policy guidance we have there. We have a couple other documents addressing air quality issues in schools and in general plans. We also have a very robust intergovernmental review program where we review all of the CEQA documents that come in from local land use agencies. We receive about 1,200 a year. About a quarter of those get comment letters from us. Very rarely we have pursued litigation against a couple of projects, one being the Skig Rail Yard, largely due to concerns about localized air quality issues for the residents and schools in the neighborhood. Also the World Logistics Center, again, air quality issues are the primary concern, or the only concern that we were raising in both of these cases.
You prevailed in both cases.
And the Skig Rail Yard, we did prevail. The World Logistics Center, we settled that case. We also have a role certainly with conducting research. So certainly we have a very robust technology demonstration and funding program here for different kinds of vehicles. School filtration, we had a very important study that we did looking at how these filters for HVAC systems work in a classroom setting. And we also, as a result, I think, of the effectiveness that we found in that study, we've done a lot of funding of filters in classrooms. We've also done some other research on near roadway mitigation measures, trying to think outside the box a little bit. Other sorts of just trying to advance the science on this. And we had a technology forum a few years back, and that's all available online. And my last slide here, looking at, well, what's coming up. So we are continuing to update our CEQA handbook. This is, I mentioned earlier, working on the warehouse piece, but as other pieces are coming to the front with facility-based measures, we will continue to update our CEQA handbook. We are also looking to initiate a new CEQA air quality mitigation fund, and this is something similar to, for example, the World Logistics Center, where a project can contribute funds to the air district, we would then turn right around and spend those funds on reducing emissions, and you can then reduce your CEQA air quality impacts. There are ways to do this on thinking about a regional basis, but also on a localized basis. And I think that is the last slide. Happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Mr. Parker. Hi, this is Supervisor Solis. Good morning. Can people hear me?
Good morning, yes, we hear you.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Ian, for the presentation. It's very informative. And of course, we're very interested in Los Angeles County about how we move ahead in reducing our PM 2.5. And my question is, I think you mentioned something about, I think it was the city of LA, I wasn't sure, that they took out, I guess, the component regarding health impacts. Could you go back over that a little bit, please?
Sure. So they did have a requirement that health risk assessments, which is a study looking at, for example, the cancer impact or the potential cancer risks of a development that is typically done during the CEQA process. They previously had a requirement for land uses close to a freeway to do those studies as part of CEQA, and they pulled that out of their CEQA process. There's been some recent activity in the courts on this issue with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the Building Industry Association saying that those are no longer actually required. We, within the 2012 AQMP, have said that we think that it's good public policy to do that kind of analysis, and CEQA is kind of the right time to do it, but local agencies can make their own decisions about what they think is most effective.
Right. Well, good. I'm more concerned that we set a good example. So I think the line of planning that you've outlined is very good, and that we need to continue on that trajectory, especially because we still don't have, I believe, in my opinion, not enough monitors out at school sites that are near our freeways. And it is important to reach out to the schools, but their parents, and regularly inform them about what the impacts are. I have a school right now in our district where we're trying to build a sound wall, and it's not even a mile. We're not even talking about a mile. And just to expand that and use transportation funds is well over $1 million. It's not reasonable. So we've got to use some other methods. I understand that may be in the works for future projects, but we definitely, in my opinion, need to inform our community where there are health impacts, and would want to ask what efforts are being made or what can be made available either through social media and perhaps forums that can be held. We need to, I think, revisit some of the schools that maybe you've had monitors at and find out where we are. I'd like to be able to see what kind of information and data come back to us. And I do want to mention I'm happy that we have agreed, Metro, the board that I sit on, with AQMD. I hope we can establish a working group around the 710 South Freeway and also any other major projects. You point out Pomona Freeway 60, where we have a high level of PM 2.5. We're going to be expanding our efforts through Caltrans and Metro on the 71 freeway, as well as the 605 and 90. I still think it's very important for us to maybe think about how we set up also working groups around major projects that are going to be going online. And I'm sure that Metro would be happy to work with AQMD on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any comments?
Yes, I could make some comments. So I'm on the regional council for the Southern California Association of Governments. And one thing we do is set those targets with CARB every year. The target this year was 19% reduction by 2035. And the main focus of that program is to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And so we don't do that when we convert to electric transportation. I mean, we don't accomplish that. We do accomplish some other good results. But reducing vehicle miles traveled has really been a challenge. And we found that over the past few years that transit ridership has decreased and purchase of new automobiles has increased. So families are now owning more cars, not fewer cars. And so all of this is really challenging because the other thing we're looking at, and Ian showed a slide, where you have the blue line and green line coming together, and all of that is right near freeways. So that is a good place to build that development where people can walk out of their house and get in the transit. So that is kind of the ultimate goal. But in the meantime, all these challenges that I've described with reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing pollution, and still building next to freeways where the pollution occurs. And we do know from studies done that Ian pointed out that families that live near those roadways, the impact on their children is severe. Children experience that decrease in lung function much more severely than adults. And so we need to be aware of that and think about protecting the children that are living near those areas. So, I mean, there are no easy solutions, but I think these guidance documents are a good start, and probably more collaboration with local elected officials and local planning officials will help us solve some of these problems. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Ian, I have a question. We use words like near and far. Can you quantify those as it relates to what is near and what is far? In addition to that, have we determined what is the most safe? You know, I look at your second slide, not the second one, but I guess your fourth slide, where it shows low regional PM 2.5, and it says that there's basically far from roadway. And it shows 100% of the effect itself of that 2.5 not being effective. Then as we go down and start using the word far away, I know that we have 500 feet and 1,000 feet that certain jurisdictions has implemented. But are those realistic as it relates to what our studies have shown a health risk?
Sure. So that's a really good question. I think what we've seen in a lot of different studies is trying to determine what is near and what is far. I think what it first started off was 500 feet. That's the guidance that, for example, is in CARB's Land Use Handbook from 2005. As more and more studies have come out, that 500 feet in many ways keeps getting extended. We've even seen some studies that take that, what is near, goes out maybe even out to 1,500 meters. I think what we do see, though, is that there is not uncommonly a very steep drop-off of pollutant concentrations as you move away from a freeway. So typically, 500 feet, a 500-foot buffer typically provides a pretty significant reduction in pollution. Certainly the farther the better. I think is one thing that we always recommend with this sort of case. I think in that bar chart that you're talking about, the case on the far left bar, I want to say that was maybe even more than a mile from a freeway. It was trying to remove all effects of anything possible from a freeway. But typically we see kind of the 500 to 1,000 foot range is typically what folks talk about for what is too much.
So basically, you said Los Angeles City, is the county also, maybe Supervisor Solis can address this, have they adopted the 500 and 1,000 foot buffer before issuing building permits? Because as an example, on 110 freeway, downtown Los Angeles, I think we've got a buffer of 15 to 20 feet. If that much. Right. So, how long have these these buffers been in existence?
If for example, with LA County, their prohibition on funding within 500 feet of a freeway, that's, I want to say at least at least 10 years, if I recall, or about 10 years, if I recall right, that they've been using that policy. And a lot of this came out of that land use guidance from CARB in 2005. When looking at what the city is doing for 1,000 feet from a freeway, some of those policies were just put into place in the last couple years. This look today about, maybe no longer requiring health risk assessments within 1,000 feet. Part of that was they now have some experience, and their experience in the LA area, they found that all the health risks typically show it's not good, right? And so if you always know it's not good and they feel that they have other policies in place that it can address it, they think there's better ways to address that issue.
Dr. Parker, if I could just add, unfortunately, the example that you give of the apartment structures next to the 110 freeway, I believe you're talking about, that's within the jurisdiction of the city of LA. So they allowed for that to happen. The county doesn't have direct jurisdiction in that in terms of the city boundaries. So that's an issue, but we obviously know how important it is to inform the community of what health hazards are there. So through our Department of Public Health services and our outreach efforts, we do try to provide that information. But obviously, it's the local jurisdiction, and that's the conundrum here, that we have to keep educating our local planning, regional planning groups that represent all the other 87 cities in the county of Los Angeles.
Mr. Chairman.
Have we issued? Yes, Ms. Mitchell.
I
Go
would
ahead.
just also comment that you see the competition here between the need for housing, which is dire in our region, and then the need for clean air, and so that is the competitive nature of what's going on here. And while we know 500 feet is the recommended norm as a distance from the roadway, there's also this other interest in getting new housing in to provide for our residents. And so, there's no good solution there, but, I've been at many summits where we're talking about the need for housing, how many homeless we have on the streets here in our region now. So that's the other thing that's going on the streets. Thank you.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I would suggest that those of you who are elected officials in these regions is basically in each one of the districts has to, when you come up with a housing plan, that each district complementarily, based on the actual, I should say, number of people that reside within that, receive a proportionate percentage of housing for homelessness, etc. That way, it basically will stop the situation of all the homeless are being placed in one district and not the others, and this kind of situation. We've got now lots of money in bond issues, but no place to build these housing, and then we find the least desirable areas in which to do it. Again, a free comment itself from one board member that may not have an effect on what the local jurisdictions may or may not do. Any further comments from any of my colleagues?
Dr. Parker, I would just add that, serving on the Metro Board gives us a unique opportunity for myself and my colleagues to talk about how we can actually weave in a better transit commutes, building along our rail system so people will not tend to then drive their cars on the freeway, and building housing out there. And some of that also allows us opportunity to have affordable, low-income housing for homeless, veterans, and transitional age youth. And we're starting that effort right now, and a lot of those plans have already been in the works, thanks to the voters that helped us pass Measure M. So our new executive director is not really new, but he's been there for 3 years. Phil Washington has been helping us move that agenda forward. And I would encourage AQMD, our staff, to really sit down and talk to our CEO about what those plans look like, because this is a time for us to intervene, and it makes sense for AQMD to be a better partner with us at Metro. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I applaud Metro. One of the things that we need to also be aware of, most of the mass transit that is going on is electrification. which is a good thing. And having housing that close to, those particular corridors and those lines is, I think, very, very effective because, one, we're reducing the pollution from cars, and two, we're basically transporting people through clean energy. Anyway, thank you very much. Are there any persons there from CC8 that would like to make any comments?
One comment from Harvey Eater.
Okay.
Dr. Parker, while Mr. Etter is coming to the table, I just wanted to respond to Supervisor Solis and let her know that we're working to set up a meeting with Phil Washington from Metro. So that's in the works.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Etter. Go right ahead.
Good morning. I'm Harvey Etter, speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. There's several points related to this item. I'd like, in the Health and Safety Code, there are two different sections of the code that kind of relate to land use and kind of have tension. And I brought this up at a board meeting. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but they're near each other and kind of inverted. But it's like Health and Safety 44014 and 44041. Anyway, it has to do with one of them says thou shalt cooperate with other cities and whatnot, to reduce air pollution emissions and for climate change, greenhouse gases. Versus that the district basically shouldn't be doing this kind of thing, can't make land use decisions. But so there is something in Health and Safety Code that contradicts that. Also, a lot of the pollution and stuff in different areas comes from trucks. I just want to say that we put in a proposal for including trucks and have been talking with BYD for close to 2 years, and they say they could produce 5,000 Class 8 trucks a year, and they could get the facility up within 6 months. I would like to see if there could be like a structure that's vertically integrated and can address issues of equity in the solar transition. And for instance, they could actually have co-ops or some corporate structure to own trucks, to own the buses, and possibly with some equity by the state as well. Anyway, and that this could also include production of solar photovoltaic cells, other types of solar systems, and storage as well. I think in addition to, also brought up the question about last month of Tesla going private and the issue of what's going to happen with Tesla. But there's a possibility that these kind of models could include Tesla, BYD. I don't know. There's a lot of manufacturers out there and whatnot. And in looking at the $60 million, when we put in a proposal for the trucks and solar electric trucks, there's one thing that we brought up is that try to extend, if it's a solar electric truck, that you should be able to get the tax credit. The argument has to be made with the IRS on everything. Now main roads also have to be looked at, and I guess this has probably been done in other studies, but like I've lived near Wilshire Boulevard and there's a lot of traffic and whatnot, and I don't, it comes in peaks and valleys, but it should be evaluated as well. So let's see. So also the Health and Safety Code, in Health and Safety Code 53002B says it, and this is from 1981. It's been part of state law that it's against the law to import non-renewable fossil fuels into the state policy. It's against state policy, legislative intent. And we import 90% now, and there's a lot of emissions in PM, and toxics have to be looked at. I don't know why you didn't look at toxics. It's basically the body count, deaths per million, premature deaths, and that's valued at 9 million per. And how much? What is the rate? I got to see calculations for, instead of using the 4,600, 4,500 premature deaths per year attributed to the district out of 7,500 for the state. The argument is being made that not all of those count at 9 million per, that there's background levels. I'd like to see the calculations for these background levels in detail, because it's not clear. I have heard the staff say that two-thirds is background and only 1/3 counts. So out of the 4,500, there's only like 1,400 that's counted. But it's still like $13.5 billion a year. 10 years, 130, 40, 50 that a system will last. You're talking, anyway.
I think you're past your time.
Okay, well, I'll make some other comments later.
Okay,
Thanks.
All right, thank you. But, oh, by the way, the law does say may be limited to 3 minutes, does not say shall.
thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
There's no one else here in CC8.
We have none here at the Let's.
None here. Okay.
Okay. The other items itself that are informational items, any questions concerning those by any of the board members? Okay, if not, then we will take those and file. And as it relates to that other written items 2 through 3. And we will, any other matters and stuff that needs to come before the board by any board members? Any other comments itself, open public comments from CC8?
Mr. Etter, yeah.
Yeah, I'm concerned about what was implemented about the limits to making comments, especially like this while something's happening. I don't know, I just wanted to say that, and because we didn't have a chance to make public input on that policy, and I think that might be questionable as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Etter. Hearing no further comments, I will basically call this meeting, it's up to adjourn, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone again on October 19th at our next Mobile Source meeting. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.